वेलकम टू दिस सेशन। ये टेक्निकल सेशन हम लोग इसकी शुरुआत करेंगे और जैसे आप लोगों को मालूम है कि इनॉग्रेशन सेशन में हमारे प्रोफेसर आनंद झा सर आप लोगों के सामने बातचीत कर रहे थे, तो उनके बातचीत के अंदाज से आप लोगों को लग गया होगा कि वो बहुत ही सिंपल और सरल अंदाज में आप लोगों के साथ बातचीत करने वाले हैं और बिल्कुल इंटरेस्टिंग अंदाज में आपसे बात करेंगे। तो सबसे पहले ओवरव्यू ऑफ ऑडियो विजुअल आर्काइविंग क्या है उसके बारे में वो बातचीत करेंगे। बिना किसी देर के मैं उनको इनवाइट करता हूँ कि वो अपना ये पोडियम संभालें और लोगों से रूबरू हो जाएं। ये नाम कोई बात नहीं, ये उन दोनों का आपस का मामला है।
इरफान अपना स्ट्रक्चर्ड प्रेजेंटेशन शुरू करें उससे पहले मैंने सोचा कि कुछ बातचीत कर लेते हैं। कुछ स्टैटिस्टिक्स की बात है। हम जानते हैं कि इंडिया का पॉपुलेशन 142 करोड़ के आसपास है। लगभग 115 करोड़ लोग हैं जिनके पास मोबाइल फोन्स है आज की डेट में। लगभग 60 करोड़ लोग ऐसे हैं जिनके पास इंटरनेट फैसिलिटी अवेलेबल है। तो डिजिटल डेटा बनाते हैं तो हम डायरेक्टली उन तक पहुंच सकते हैं और उसके लिए हमें कोई प्लेटफॉर्म डेवलप करने की ज़रूरत नहीं है कि हम कैसे उनको पहुंचाएं। तो अगर हम डिजिटल डेटा बना रहे हैं तो ये हमारे पास बेनिफिट है कि हम 60 करोड़ लोगों तक डायरेक्टली पहुंच सकते हैं, उनके मोबाइल तक पहुंच सकते हैं। अगर हम अपने डेटा को इंटरेस्टिंग बनाएं तो लोग अपने आप जुड़ेंगे। तो ये हमारे पास बहुत बड़ी बेनिफिट है। आज से कुछ साल पहले तक जब हम कुछ बनाते थे टेक्निकली तो हमें ये रहता था कि ये लोगों तक कैसे पहुंचेगी, लेकिन आज वो प्लेटफॉर्म तैयार है। ऐसा कोई भी गांव नहीं है अब जहाँ पे नेटवर्क कनेक्टिविटी अवेलेबल नहीं है। तो ये नेटवर्क कनेक्टिविटी अवेलेबल है, हाई स्पीड कनेक्टिविटी अवेलेबल है, लोगों के पास मोबाइल है, मोबाइल इंटरनेट कनेक्शन है। तो ये एक प्लेटफॉर्म है डिसेमिनेशन के लिए जो तैयार है और हमें उसको यूटिलाइज करनी है। हम ऑडियो विजुअल पे आए उससे पहले हम थोड़ी सी डिजिटल डेटा की बात करें। जो आज के डेट में हम जो भी अपनी डे टू डे एक्टिविटी करते हैं सब डिजिटल प्लेटफॉर्म पे करते हैं, चाहे वो हमारी बैंकिंग हो, चाहे कम्युनिकेशंस हो, ईमेल हो, सब कुछ डिजिटल डेटा डिजिटल प्लेटफॉर्म पे बन रही है, उसके ऊपर में काम कर रहे हैं। इसमें से कुछ डेटा ऐसे हैं जिसकी लॉन्ग टर्म जरूरत नहीं है। आपने बैंकिंग ट्रांजेक्शन आज किया, 5 साल 10 साल के बाद उसकी शायद जरूरत नहीं होगी। डे टू डे ईमेल और कम्युनिकेशंस की जो चीज़ है उसकी बहुत लॉन्ग टर्म प्रिजर्वेशन की जरूरत नहीं है, लेकिन ऐसे बहुत सारे कल्चरल डेटा है आज जिसको हम बना रहे हैं तो उसकी लॉन्ग टर्म प्रिजर्वेशन की जरूरत है। तो उसको हम कैसे आइडेंटिफाई करें, कैसे प्रिजर्व करें, ये एक चैलेंज है। और इसके साथ ही हम जो हमारे पुराने एनालॉग फॉर्मेट में जो डेटा है उसको डिजिटाइज कर रहे हैं। तो जो डेटा डिजिटल डेटा जनरेट हो रही है वो एक तो बॉर्न डिजिटल जो हम बना रहे हैं आज के डेट में, और दूसरा वो जो हम एनालॉग से कन्वर्ट करके डिजिटल बना रहे हैं। और वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमिक फोरम का एक रिपोर्ट है जो ये बता रही है कि 2025 ईस्वी तक एवरीडे हम 469 एक्साबाइट ऑफ डेटा एवरीडे जनरेट करेंगे। और ये जो एक्साबाइट है वो 1000 पीटाबाइट का है और एक पीटाबाइट जो है वो 1000 टेराबाइट का है। इतना डेटा हम पर डे जनरेट करेंगे ऐसा एस्टिमेट है। जो दूसरी एस्पेक्ट है इसका कि जैसे जैसे हम डिजिटल डेटा बनाते जा रहे हैं उसके ऊपर में साइबर थ्रेट्स भी आ रही है, साइबर क्राइम भी बढ़ता जा रहा है। जो बहुत सारे बैंकिंग फ्रॉड्स के बारे में हम लोग जानते हैं। 2020 में इंडिया में लगभग 2 लाख के करीब डिजिटल क्राइम बैंकिंग से रिलेटेड डिजिटल क्राइम जो है वो रिपोर्ट की गई और ये एवरी ईयर अप्रॉक्सीमेटली 22 to 25% बढ़ रही है और ये वर्ल्ड वाइड फेनोमेना है। केवल इंडिया में ऐसे बढ़ रही है ऐसा नहीं है, पूरे विश्व में ये इसी रेट से बढ़ रही है। दूसरी चीज़ ये है कि जो डिजिटल डेटा के प्रिजर्वेशन के लिए या स्टोरेज के लिए जो हम प्लेटफॉर्म यूज़ कर रहे हैं, ऑलमोस्ट पूरे विश्व में उसी तरह का यूज़ हो रहा है। इसमें 2-3 चीज़ें हैं। एक तो जो डेटा हम बना रहे हैं, वो हम प्रोप्राइटरी फॉर्मेट में नहीं बनाएँ। ये एक मेजर चैलेंज है। जैसे हम वर्ड फाइल बनाते हैं तो माइक्रोसॉफ्ट ऑफिस यूज़ करते हैं, माइक्रोसॉफ्ट का प्रोप्राइटरी आइटम है। इसको हम ओपन प्लेटफॉर्म में कैसे यूज़ करें? चाहे वो एक्सेल शीट हो, चाहे वर्ड फाइल हो, चाहे ऑडियो एंड विजुअल फॉर्मेट हो, तो प्रोप्राइटरी आइटम से हमें बचा करके कैसे रखना है अपने डेटा को कि हम कंपनी स्पेसिफिक एप्लीकेशन पे डिपेंडेंट नहीं रहें। दूसरी चीज़ ये है कि ये जब डेटा बनती है और जब हम डेटाबेसेस के थ्रू उसको इंटीग्रेट करने की कोशिश करते हैं, तो जो डेटाबेसेस भी हो, वो भी हमें देखना है कि वो भी ओपन प्लेटफॉर्म पे बना हो, जिससे कि उसमें उस डेटाबेस में हमारा डेटा लॉक नहीं हो। और तीसरा चीज़ ये है कि जब इस डेटा को हम पब्लिक डोमेन में लेकर के जाएँ, तो इस पर साइबर अटैक नहीं हो। और इसके लिए ओपन स्टैंडर्ड्स के अलग-अलग फॉर्मेट्स हैं, जिसके जब हम डिजिटाइज़ेशन के बारे में बात करेंगे, तो उसके बारे में बात करेंगे। लेकिन ये जो क्राइम की स्पीड बढ़ रही है, इसके बारे में अगेन जो वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमिक फोरम का क्राइम स्टैटिस्टिक्स रिपोर्ट, एस्टिमेटेड क्राइम स्टैटिस्टिक्स रिपोर्ट 2023 का है। वो ये बता रहा है कि 2-3 साल में ऐसा एक सिचुएशन आएगी, जब ये क्राइम बहुत बढ़ जाएगी, क्योंकि जो क्रिमिनल्स हैं, उनको पता है कि सबके प्लेटफ़ॉर्म एक ही जैसे सिस्टम पे बने हुए हैं, और अगर वो एक को क्रैक करने में तैयार हो गए, तो सबके जो सिक्योरिटी लेयर्स हैं, उसको क्रैक कर देंगे। तो ऐसा एस्टिमेटेड है कि अगले कुछ सालों 2-4 सालों में ऐसा समय आएगा, जब सिक्योरिटी थ्रेट्स बहुत बढ़ जाएगी, जो भी हम आर्काइव्स बना रहे हैं उसके ऊपर में। और उसके लिए फिर आईएसओ का 27,000 सीरीज़ स्टार्ट हुआ, जो ये बता रहा है कि हम किस तरह से अपने डेटा को बचाएँ, सिक्योरिटी पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से, कि ये डेटा हमारा बचा रह सके। तो ये कुछ-कुछ इश्यूज़ हैं। जब हम ऑडियो विजुअल पे जाएँगे, और ऑडियो विजुअल पे क्यों इतना थ्रस्ट एरिया है, उसके लिए रिज़वान साहब ने सुबह में ही बताया कि इन्फॉर्मेशन रिटेंशन का जो सिस्टम है, जब हम टेक्स्ट पढ़ के कोई इन्फॉर्मेशन को रिटेन करना चाहते हैं, तो हम 60%, 55 टू 60% तक हम उसको रिटेन कर सकते हैं लॉन्ग टर्म में। जब हम विजुअल देख करके करते हैं, तो ये हम 75 टू 80% तक। लेकिन जब हम ऑडियो विजुअल के थ्रू इन्फॉर्मेशन को रिटेन करना चाहते हैं, तो 90% से ऊपर पहुँच जाती है। इसीलिए ऑडियो विजुअल का इम्पोर्टेंस है। तो ऑडियो विजुअल में आने से पहले मैं ये सोच रहा था कि ये कुछ स्टैटिस्टिक्स वर्ल्ड लेवल पे जो है, वो आप लोगों के साथ शेयर करूँ। अब मैं इरफान को इनवाइट करता हूँ कि स्ट्रक्चर्ड इन्फॉर्मेशन बताएँ।
Thank you, sir. Broad picture देने के लिए, because that is extremely important for us to have when we are going through the small steps. I thought कि हम लोग पहला session we'll try and focus on an overview of archiving with a little bit of an element of audio visual. थोड़ा we'll start to move through the steps. So to begin with a sort of a working definition of what is an archives. आई थिंक हमारी एक इंट्यूटिव अंडरस्टैंडिंग तो है सबकी कि एक आर्काइव क्या होता है, या फिर इफ वी क्लोज आवर आईज वी कैन इमेजिन व्हाट एन आर्काइव लुक्स लाइक. बट बेसिकली एन आर्काइव इज अ रेपोजिटरी वेयर पीपल कैन सर्च फॉर फर्स्ट हैंड इंफॉर्मेशन. ठीक है, तो दो कीवर्ड्स हमारे पास आ गए, रेपोजिटरी एंड फर्स्ट हैंड इंफॉर्मेशन. ठीक है, एंड दिस फर्स्ट हैंड इंफॉर्मेशन कैन बी इन मेनी डिफरेंट काइंड्स ऑफ फॉर्म्स. It can be in the form of letters, reports, notes, memos, photographs, audio and video recordings, and various other kinds of sources. So, if we look at all of these different kinds of sources of first-hand information, we can immediately start thinking of various kinds of archives. वो कौन सी archive होगी जिसमें letters, reports, notes होंगे? वो कौन सी तरह की आर्काइव होगी जिसमें प्राइमरीली ऑडियो और वीडियो रिकॉर्डिंग्स होंगी? वो कौन सी आर्काइव होगी जिसमें प्राइमरीली फोटोग्राफ्स होंगे. तो एक टाइपोलॉजी ऑलरेडी एक एमर्ज करना शुरू कर देती है कि ये अलग अलग तरह की आर्काइव्स हो सकती हैं. डॉक्यूमेंट की आर्काइव्स, वी आर मोर अवेयर ऑफ थिंग्स like for example the National Archives of India, which is primarily a document archives. It is a government archive. It will have reports, it will have memos, it will have letters, it has personal collections of scholars, but all focused primarily on the written word. And we are trying to figure out the movement from the written word to an audiovisual. ठीक है? So when we think of this kind of documentary heritage, which is in the form of documents, paper या digital documents को हम देखें, so that is one kind of first-hand information. Another kind of first-hand information is photographs. Photographs we have predating audiovisual heritage, right? We have photographs soon after the mutiny of 1857. We have photographs of India starting from the late 1850s onwards. And there are specialized collections of photographs in British Library, in various other libraries of the world, including our several repositories, even private ones like Al-Qazi Foundation in Delhi and several others, which have old archival photographs. And there is an entire field of study which has developed around that as well. A kind of a visual art या art history perspective से अगर हम लोग उसको देखें तो. And then we come to audio and video recordings, which is the youngest, so to say, the form of this kind of first-hand information documentation. Audio recording, I'll come to a more sort of a structured kind of a timeline, but audio recordings begins from the late 1890s. So we already are about 135 years of audio recordings which are available globally. Video recordings begin, let's say, from the 1910s or so. And we have about 100 odd years, a little over 100 years of video recordings, silent recordings to begin with, and then also layered with sound as well. So इससे हम लोगों को एक idea मिल रहा है. An archive can be of various kinds. We are traditionally more sort of attuned to thinking of archives as document archives, because like we mentioned in the inaugural session, हम लोगों का जो in our part of the world, the sort of understanding of archiving photographs, the understanding of archiving audio and video recordings has come very late. So we have traditionally thought of archives as document or paper archives. If we think of the National Archives of India, the ongoing digitization project at the National Archives of India, with a massive team of doing the digitization work, is also expected to only cover 100% digitization maybe over the next 5 to 10 years. We have such a massive amount of document archives. And this is, the National Archive was set up, of course, it has documents predating the independence. So there is a lot of historical content there. And also now we have more than 75 years since independence. That is, it has kept getting added on. Photograph archives are a little lesser in number, especially if we look at repositories which have archival photographs dating from the late 1800s and the early 1900s. There are very few focused collections like that. But now photographs, of course, is an area which has boomed like anything with the revolution of the smartphone. I think शायद ही कोई दिन जाता है कि हम लोग अपने फोन से फोटोज नहीं लेते हैं. We will be taking photos of family functions, of our own selves, of places we visit, of workshops like this. Every day we are just creating more and more bigger repositories of photographs. And in fact, in many ways, there is now also a need to do a focused digital repository for visual content as well, which is primarily focused on photographs, both from the negatives, glass plate negatives and positives, down to digital. And we tried at IGNCA to also build a visual repository. Maybe at some point of time we'll be able to do that as well. And then the third kind, which we will end up focusing on, audio and video recording. So this was important for you to keep in mind what an archive is and what are the different kinds of things that would be in an archive. Now, if we try to move towards a slightly more technical definition of what is an archive, we can look at the Dictionary of Archival Terminology, which is done by the International Council of Archives. It talks about various kinds of things either in an archive or the function as to what an archive does. ठीक है? What is preserved in an archive are primarily non-current records. Okay? So is this clear? Because current records are what we are actively working on. And so, for example, if we think of an institution like MANUU or IGNCA, there are a number of projects and then there are a number of files which are in circulation as of right now through the various processes of approvals and output and all of that. So those are current records. Those are not part of an archival collection. Only after a significant amount of time has passed that they become non-current records. Okay, and usually, as far as National Archives of India is concerned, their timeline for what they consider non-current records is at least 25 plus years. Yeah. So when the ministries and the various departments start to weed out old files, they go to the National Archives of India. And there is a systematic process of retention, and there's a selection, what can be weeded out, what has to be kept, what has to be retained, what has to be accessioned, what has to be digitized. And wo pura ek alag task hai. So first thing we need to keep in mind about an archive is that it's a place where non-current records are preserved. Yeah. With or without selection. Again, this is something which is at the it's the prerogative of the archive whether it wants to select records with selection or whether it wants to preserve everything without selection. And this task is done by those who are responsible for the creation or by the successors in function for their use. Okay, is this clear? Usually when we are creating an archives, we are thinking of an audience which is in the future. Okay, when we are thinking of an archives, also to think of current usage, but the primary audience of an archive is an audience in the future. We are preserving for the future so that this information is available at a later date. Or we nominate those who are going to be our successors to look after this information. So this is a kind of a legacy thing, just like people when they are old, they write a will of their own that, okay, this property or this thing which belongs to me will be taken care of, this legal heir. Similarly, institutions also have this system where they have to think of a succession plan of whatever they have generated, either in form of documents or in form of audio recordings, video recordings, photographs. Now, when important people leave institutions, a lot of knowledge goes away with them. And this is a sad truth about institutions in this part of the world, much more than in the West, because in the West, they have much more structured plans of succession, and they also have much better document keeping and process, and sort of standard operating procedures and processes are much more sort of systematized. So now that when I think of I've now been at the IGNC a little over 10 years. And now that I look at Sir, Sir will be leaving IGNCA after next year. I'm thinking what will happen to all the institutional knowledge that he has. What will the IGNCA do? Or whether the IGNCA is itself concerned about that, as it should be, because the people who have been at the helm of these institutions for a long time have seen the organic growth of these institutions, have also been witness to all the policy changes and a kind of a historical timeline of organizations which the new staff does not have access to. So when I came into the IGNCA in 2013, it was thanks to people like Jha sir and several others who were able to share their understanding of the institution, so that I was able to try and do some work within that context. So this succession is a very important thing which we unfortunately in our institutions don't always think of. This handing over, whether it is of archival content, whether it's of institutions, records, institutional history, is not something which has happened. So this is important, and archives play a very important role in this task. The second way to think about it is that an archive is an institution which is responsible for several set of tasks. It is responsible for acquisition, preservation, and communication. Okay, so acquisition, it is actively either taking information from outside. So for example, if we again go back to the example of National Archives of India, it is getting records from the various ministries and the various government departments. So it is acquiring. It could also be you are generating yourself. So that could also be thought of as a kind of acquisition, like building up. Preservation, and preservation comes with a whole set of tasks. We'll get into those things a little bit later. And communication. So communication, making all of these records accessible, preparing them for access, preparing them for other people to be able to see them, to read them, to interpret them, to understand them, to research on them, to create content based on them. All of that is part of communication, or even outreach, so to say. So archives in this sense can be also thought of, as where they are situated. Are archives standalone institutions, or are they situated inside an existing institution? So for example, if we take the instance of IGNCA, we are an institution which also has an archives inside of it. One digital archives and one physical archives. Our physical archives is called the Cultural Archives, which has a number of individual collections of scholars, of noted personalities. So there are different kinds of collections. There are audio-video recordings, there are photographs, there are sculpture objects, there are musical instruments, there are documents, there are letters, there are photographs, all kinds of stuff which has come to us either by donation, or it has been generated out of the process of the institution's own functioning over the last 25, 30 years now. But it could also be that it's a standalone archives, like again, something like the National Archives of India. It's primarily, there is no archive situated inside National Archives of India. It is in entirety an archives. So, but usually archives have that flexibility that archives can also be situated inside of other institutions. So similarly, we have a number of archives which are housed inside broadcast and production houses, or they are housed inside research institutions, or they are housed inside universities. Those are also archives. So it also helps to think like that. And another way of thinking of an archives is, it can be thought of as a physical structure. It's a building or a part of a building where the material that has been given to the archives, or it is held by the archives, it's available for consultation. So similarly, if we think of, say, a university archives, if a research scholar is doing his say 25 years of MANUU, they will go to the various departments that are part of MANUU. They will look through the administrative files. They will look through all kinds of documents to do that kind of research. And that set of materials can be thought of as an archival repository of sorts. Okay, is this clear? If I'm going too fast, please feel free to interject. No, the second one is the National Cultural Audiovisual Archives, which we are fronting, which is a digital archives. Yeah. So a physical archives and a digital archives. Shukriya for that. So now let us think of, we have already discussed this a little bit, but let us think of the various kinds of archives. So first and foremost, we need to think of national level or the government archives. Again, we've been talking about, so National Cultural Audiovisual Archives is a government archives, is also a national archive, that it is a representative of audiovisual archiving in the whole country. 30 institutions from across the country are our partners, and we are hoping to grow that to 300 or further. So let us see what we are able to do. So that is the big archives at the national level, or at the fronted or funded by the government, both by central government as well as state government. There's a number of state government archives which have in fact worked much better than central government archives. The second kinds of archives are primarily research archives. Okay, and in this you also include university archives. And practically all universities, especially a lot of the private universities which have been set up in India over the last 10, 15 years or so, have all got an archives of their own, where they are safekeeping their own material, and they're also accepting donations of material. So for example, in 2022, I taught a course at Ashoka University, and Ashoka University has a big university archives, and they've got a lot of personal collections that have come into their university archive collection. So for example, while I was teaching there, they received the Dr. Manmohan Singh collection, the complete collection of all the papers and everything that was generated during Dr. Manmohan Singh's public life, which was a long, long career. So similarly, Amartya Sen archives and so many important scholars whose contributions have been to so many different fields, their collections have been donated to university archives. And also there have been standalone institutions which are research archives in their own sense. So for example, one of our partners, one of the partners of the National Cultural Audiovisual Archives is an institution called Rupayan Sansthan, which is based in Jodhpur. And it's an archive of the lifestyle and cultural heritage of Western Rajasthan. So it's totally focused on a particular region, and they've done a very thorough documentation of their lifestyle of the communities, the oral histories, the performing arts, all of those things. So it is a research archive which is focused on a region. Similarly, we have archives which are focused on performing arts, or archives which are focused on theater and things like that. So those are focused research archives. Thirdly, we have production and broadcast archives, and IMC is really one of that. 25 years of its existence. It has built up a rich collection of its own. I'm told more than 3,000 unique titles, and a significant amount of digital data that it has generated over the years and continues to generate every day through also its various social media outreach channels. So those are more focused on production and broadcast, also with an educational bent. So in the case of IMC, a lot of focal point for the production of things here is also to create content for ongoing courses on campus, as well as for distance education. We have another archives, which is our partner, which is a production and broadcast archive. It's an institution headed by Siddharth Kak, who's a well-known television personality. His institution in Bombay is called Cinema Vision India. And this is the institution through which the television program called Surabhi was created. And so we have the complete footage of those episodes that were created. So for every episode of 30 minutes that was created, about 30 hours of filming was done, and we have those uncut material in our archives. So that's another kind of archives. Then we can think of community archives. There's a lot of communities, especially the communities which are smaller or marginalized communities. For example, I can think of the Parsi community. There's a foundation called the Parzor Foundation, which has developed and maintained a very strong community archives of the Parsis in India. They have down to the level of how many Parsis living in individual cities of India. So they put together a map once in an exhibition in Delhi that there are 7 Parsis in Rajkot and 23 Parsis in Ahmedabad. That level of documentation they've got of their own community. So we can think of community archives. Then, of course, we think of corporate archives. All the big corporate houses that have been around 50, 60, 100 years have always maintained their own archives. So, for example, the Tatas have a very, very rich corporate archives, and they are, of course, a corporate house which has, sort of been in so many different sectors, from transportation to arts and culture to airlines to hospitality to consultancies to software, everything. So it's a very rich corporate archives, and if ever anyone has to do a kind of a corporate history of India, that those are the kinds of archives which they would need to tap. Then there are a lot of religious archives, which could be held with religious institutions. So the mutts or the various madrasas or the dargahs, they all have kutub khanas where there is a lot of manuscripts. There's a lot of old books, rare books, which have been preserved. And finally, we have digital archives. So for instance, the National Cultural Audiovisual Archives is a digital archives. From the beginning, we have been fully digital, 100% digital archives. So we are the kinds of archives that have been set up following the digital transformation, so for, say, 2010 or so onwards, when everything, all kinds of data is being generated digitally. So is this clear? The various kinds of types of archives? Yeah. So it's a research archives. It's a research archives because it's working on a focal area on language. Within language, then subset. So Urdu is one. Then now they are doing work in Punjabi, also in Rajasthani, and several others. So they are a focused research archive in that sense. With a focal point also, they intersect with digital archives. There's also that element. So now that we know various kinds of archives, let's think about what actually archives contain. We know the container now, the various kinds of archives. So we can think of manuscript archives to begin with. Those, in that sense, can be thought of as the earliest instances of archives in that sense. I don't think we should slot manuscript repositories into libraries in that sense. They are really archives in the sense that they are storehouses of traditional knowledge systems and things like that, which and archives are also institutions which are open to research and interpretation and reinterpretation and creation and recreation of knowledge. So manuscripts, archives contain a lot of manuscripts. Archives contain official documents, letters and other records of communication, reports, minutes of meetings. So for example, if we are doing a 3-day workshop here, I'm sure that it will end up on some file of MANUU that a 3-day workshop was conducted. These topics were covered. So many people came. So many people slept through the sessions. Sorry, just kidding. So minutes of meetings are also important elements. Other unpublished sources like registers, handwritten documents. We think of, when I was looking at the personal collection of Dr. Manmohan Singh at Ashoka University, there were also letters he had written when he was a student at University of Oxford, which were contained there. So if you look at it that way, it's a very interesting way to look at the biography of a person in that sense. Then archives contain a lot of maps. Interestingly, for those who are interested in maps, the National Archives of India has a very rich collection of maps, and so does the Delhi Archives, and I would imagine so would the Telangana State Archives would also have. And cartography is a very interesting area where we get to see the kind of changes that have taken place in the geographic distribution of regions and the entire states, how they were carved out of the union and things like that. Then what else do archives contain? Archives contain photographs and films, digital files, and sound recording. So these are the more sort of recent archives in that sense, that in a hard copy format or in a digital format, they contain photographs, films, and audiovisual materials. Now we come to a slightly more interactive part of this. Now that I've told you so many things, now it's time for you guys to tell me some stuff. Okay. So why should we archive? There are various reasons attached to the value of our archiving, why to archive. Historical, cultural, legal, administrative, educational. Now, can I request anyone to give any examples of these various kinds of values? So, for instance, let's say educational value of an archive. What is an educational value of an archive? Anyone? Is there an educational value? Should we be creating archives, or there's no point? You go on relearning. And what else? Next generation. Yes, archive and next generation is tied closely to each other. Historical value. Anything you can say about the historical value associated with archives? For reference. What else? Can we think of any kind of history writing without an archive? I'm talking about scholarly history writing, not creative history writing. You can't think of any kind of history writing without well-kept archives, right? I mean, historians, how is it that historians who are sitting in remote corners of the world are writing on various aspects of Indian history, so to say? By referring to various archives. There are entire groups of scholars who have worked on various aspects of Indian history, Indian arts and culture, who have never come to India, who have seen material only through the archives and written on that basis. There's a lot of legal value associated with archives. Can anyone give me any reason, or what is the understanding of legal value of why should we archive? Proof of what? So I will request Sir to share a very interesting instance of what happened with the National Museum and its document or its digitization of the manuscript collection that they had. And I think there was a question, RTI question that was raised, that the National Museum has such a large collection of manuscripts. What percentage has it digitized, and what it has digitized, why has it not made available or accessible yet? And they were unable to locate or find what they had digitized. And it was IGNCA and Jhasar to the rescue, which helped them in the legal case. The case had the issue had escalated so much that it had become a matter of courts, that the person who had made the initial request had gone to court with the request that the National Museum is not making its collection accessible to us, and we as taxpayers have all the right to access this collection. And then they ran about helter-skelter to try and find what had been digitized. And when they couldn't, they came to IGNCA, because we had done the digitization work for them. Am I telling it right, sir, more or less? So there are various kinds of values associated with the question, why should we archive? It's very, very important, whether we are in an arts and culture institution, whether we are in a university, whether in a research institution, a production broadcast house. An archive is the bedrock or the foundation for what would be looked upon as the institution's output, institution's history, institution's contribution. And then for those tasks, it is very, very important that we place a premium and importance to archive. Now, to make it very, very simple, there are two key functions of archiving. One is preservation, one is access. The two are totally linked with each other. Unfortunately, also what had happened in this domain of archives, not so much in the domain of libraries. Libraries, thankfully, from the beginning had stayed open to either if they are a university library, they were open to students. If they were a public library, they were open to public or community library or whatever. But archives tended to place much more premium on preservation and much less premium on providing access. And this is a way in which really the archives domain fractured its own foundations in a big way. If from the beginning we had equal importance placed on preservation and access, then it would have sort of helped the task of this domain of knowledge contained in these institutions. Preservation without access is pointless. Why to preserve if we are not providing access to it? So it's only from the late 1980s or so globally that an entire thrust was placed on access. That much had been done in the domain of preservation already in institutions across the world, but much more needs to be done in the domain of providing access to what is being preserved. And this was one of the key challenges in front of us also when we were setting up the National Cultural Audiovisual Archives in 2013-14. The challenge was, how can we from the very beginning be an open access archive? That whatever we digitize, we make available to people. And from the day one, whatever is digitized has been going to our web portal. So if we have digitized 31,500 hours of material, all 31,500 hours is on our web portal for free streaming and viewing. So we wanted to make sure that we do not end up privileging one over the other. We try to maintain a balance between preservation and access. So these are the two key functions of any archival institution. Is this clear? Any doubts so far? Anything which is unclear, or it means either everything is crystal clear or not clear at all? In any case, we move forward. Okay. It's available online for global access. I'll show it to you. Thank you for giving that opportunity that we show our web portal. This is our web portal, the National Cultural Audiovisual Archives. It's ncaa.gov.in. Okay. And you see that the total number of digital records preserved on the archives is 21,989. So about 22,000 unique recordings are available on this website, on our web portal, on our digital repository. And you can play anything and everything free. Can I use the audio? This is Pandit Ravi Shankar, Bharat Ratna Pandit Ravi Shankar, teaching his daughter, Anushka. And you see all the metadata associated with every recording. So we have so many instances. Sorry, I'll cover this. We have so many recordings of Pandit Ravi Shankar which are available online or which have been published either on LPs or CDs or DVDs, but none of them have him teaching his students, you know. This is unique in that sense, and this is a historic documentation. So all the recordings which are available on our archives are all free to access and only streaming for sound as well as the video recordings. And for every recording, we have the associated metadata. We will come to metadata and all when we move along with this course. So the associated information, the cataloging information relevant to this recording is available along with the recording. And you have the possibility of sharing it on the various social media platforms as well. So everything that has been digitized as part of the National Cultural Audiovisual Archives is available online through this repository, and we hope for these to be permanent links. So just as you can insert a stable URL for JSTOR and things like that in your research, you can utilize repositories like these also in your publications. Oh, sorry. Okay, Now that we have a little basic understanding of what an archives is, various types of archives, we turn to a little bit towards the uniqueness of audiovisual records, audio and video recordings, which are key as far as if we think of documentation of intangible cultural heritage, we cannot think of any other mode of documentation apart from audiovisual, because they are the only methods of documenting across the two dimensions of space and time. Usually when we think of photographs, we think of maps, it's only the dimension of space. Time gets sort of, cut out of it. You don't get a sense of what was the context like, what was the environment like, what did it sound like when these photographs were taken, which season, who were the people there, what conversations. But if we think of audio and video recordings, we get that dimension of time as well. So this is the only medium which allows for both these dimensions to be captured. And as far as intangible cultural heritage is concerned, this is the domain where the least amount of focus has been placed in our common or shared understanding of cultural heritage. We have focused on that which is visible directly to the eyes much more. So we have tended to focus much more on tangible heritage. We have focused much more on monuments or buildings or heritage precincts. We have the Qutub Shahi tombs here in Hyderabad. So when we think of heritage, we think of these buildings or monuments much more than thinking about a way of life or oral history or performing arts. These tend to come later, because they are far more, they are intangible, they are ephemeral, they cannot be there is no touch and feel to it. It's an experience in space and time, and if you are not a participant in that space and time, you miss out on it. So even in the global discourse, in the UNESCO discourse, intangible cultural heritage came much later. From the late 1960s onwards, there was conversation, because till then all the focus of cultural heritage across the world had been on tangible cultural heritage. So intangible cultural heritage is really the domain which is our strength. If we look at India, the various communities, the various regions, the various ways of life, our languages, our dressing, our food, our performances, music, dance, theater, regional, all kinds of things. This intangible cultural heritage is where the real essence of an entire nation lies. And this can be documented only through audiovisual means. So just a little bit of an idea, and after this I will close the first session. What is intangible cultural heritage? And we need to keep this in mind. There's a lot of components, and these are not exhaustive. This is just indicative. There are a lot of components when we think of intangible cultural heritage. Of course, we can think of performing arts, visual arts, crafts, folklore, rituals, social practices, iconographies. They are all intangible in the sense that their understanding is embedded in our minds and beings and civilizationally, not in some particular object that, okay, we went to Humayun's tomb and we saw Humayun's tomb and we came back. We did not bring Humayun's tomb back with us. We brought the memory of Humayun's tomb back with us, and that is the intangible part of it. And each of these sections have their own large elements. So if we look at performing arts, contain music, dance, theater. If we look at within music, if we look at Indian music, we have Hindustani and Carnatic music in the classical. We have folk music traditions, we have tribal music traditions, we have contemporary music, we have film music, we have so many different kinds. So every one of these, so visual arts can similarly be also magnified. similarly. So the domain or the realm of the intangible cultural heritage is far larger than we think about it. And it's here that audiovisual attains its special and unique place, because that's the only medium through which intangible cultural heritage can be captured. Okay, so with this, I close the first bit. We can have a little bit of a discussion. If something has not been clear, we can talk about that. And after that, I'll get into handling of audiovisual after a 5-minute break, maybe for tea or something. So any questions, anything, any thoughts? If we would like this to be a bit more interactive, so don't be surprised if all of a sudden I stop speaking. That means that you have to start speaking. Ha, jo bhi, please. I'm sorry because I'm talking in English because I can teach only in that language. नहीं तो फिर बहुत broken हो जाएगा. हाँ, मैं समझ लूँगा. आप you can. Cultural?
या किसी दूसरी चीजों पे
हाँ, तो ये नेशनल कल्चरल ऑडियो विजुअल आर्काइव्स है ना, तो हम लोगों का जो मैंडेट है, दैट इज बेसिकली गॉट टू डू विद documentation of, so if you read that, the National Cultural Audiovisual Archive aims to ensure long-term access to oral traditions, performing arts, ritual cultural practices, and traditional knowledge systems of India in audiovisual form. So primary thrust is on the cultural word. It's not the National Audiovisual Archives, which might be done much better by, say, the Information and Broadcasting Ministry or All India Radio and Doordarshan and all. But since we are situated inside the Culture Ministry, our focus is culture. Our focus and again, within that, our focus is primarily on intangible culture. But there are a lot of recordings in our collection which are documentation of archaeological sites and things like that. Again, that gives us a historic perspective. So if the Humayun's tomb complex was video recorded in the 1930s, what did it look like then? What does it look like now, 100 years later? So in that sense, but we are focused on cultural material only. And the other thing which we are focused is on unpublished material. What has not been published commercially, either through film or through CDs, DVDs, in terms of performances. What has been commercially published is out of our realm, because that then is the property of those companies which have produced it, and then they reap monetary benefits out of that. We try and preserve material which is unpublished, which is non-commercial, and focused on culture. Huh? Hyderabad karna. There's a lot of recordings of Hyderabad. The palaces of Hyderabad, Charminar, and this is a documentation of Charminar from 1996. So almost 30 years back. What did Charminar look like? This is, I think, from the archives of Cinema Vision. So the chudi shops, all kinds of stuff. The vendors, you get a. Then what else do we have of Hyderabad? We have documentation of food from Hyderabad. And many volumes of that. 15, 20 volumes of documentation of cuisine. That food is also by Cinema Vision, yes. There are few, but there are. Then there is a documentation of going back to the 1960s of Carnatic music concerts that were held in Hyderabad. They were called the Hyderabad Sadas or the Sabhas. So we have audio recordings of those. No, Rabindra Bharati is not one of our partners. Fish medicine exhibition, making of lac bangles, pearl ornaments ka making. So anyone who's researching on any of these fields, there's a lot of primary material here, and a lot of this material is now at least 30-40 years old. So you get a immediate historic perspective from the audiovisual front on doing that. What else do we have? We will come to that slowly but steadily. Chowma Allah Palace, Falaknuma, Bidri Bangles, coverage of Qutub Shahi tombs from 1990s when it looked very different. Now that it has been conserved by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, it looks very different. So this kind of a documentation of a archaeological site is so significant because it provides a historical basis for those who are doing the conservation work on the monuments as well. It's one thing to have photographic documentation, but a video documentation obviously adds many more layers to it. And it's so focused. You see, you can get a thorough sense of the various parts of the building, individual shots and all. So there's a lot of stuff. You can think of any discipline to search for if you're interested. Let's say, okay, let's search for something which I like. Qawwali. You can get tons of performances from various parts of the country. One sec. So interesting. Sounds of Namaz from 1972. Okay, more than 50 years back. Interesting. These are all institutions' copyrights. We don't own copyrights. The institutional repositories from where the material has come, they continue to hold the copyrights. It's available only for streaming and for research reference. But if you want to utilize it in any other way, we put you in touch with the institution from where the recording has come. So there have been lots of requests to us from institutions in India as well as abroad that we are mounting an exhibition on this theme and we saw a recording on this theme. Can we utilize this? So we put them in touch with that institution that you can collaborate directly. So we have done the task of unlocking a lot of these collections, which were just sitting on shelves in these institutions. Now they are available globally for people to access. And our collection is accessed, only 1/4 of our web footfall is from India. 3/4 of our web footfall is from outside India. So the interest in cultural heritage, ICH from India, is much more from outside India than in India. And we need to change that, I think, because so much of our cultural history has been written by foreigners. And this is the truth. But we have all this material as well. Why can't we research on these things ourselves, utilize these archival sources, and also produce scholarly works which sort of have the same sort of relevance and importance in the global field? Yes, कुंभ का है.
कुंभ का एक पुराना वाला कोई वीडियो दिखाइए.
अब वो पूरा एक्सप्लोरेशन एनसीए का. अच्छा, ये नहीं देखिए. 2003 ये नासिक का है, कुंभ फ्रॉम 2003. I think the focused documentation is only from 2003 Nasik, as far as Kumbh is concerned. The other melas are there, Nauchandi melas, Pushkar mela. There's a lot of melas. Fairs and festivals, there's a huge section on fairs and festivals that we have. But Kumbh Mela is primarily just from Nasik. And I think that was part of an entire effort to do cultural mapping, which was done by IGRMS, which is a focused anthropological archives. का नेट बहुत स्लो चल रहा है, इसीलिए स्ट्रीमिंग नहीं हो पा रहा है. But you can explore it. Oh yeah, here we are. Processions of the Kumbh Mela. There's a lot of interesting stuff. You can think of any subject. I often, when I go to make presentations about National Cultural Audiovisual Archives, I like to throw a challenge that if there is a field in the domain of art and culture in which there is no recording, then I will accept defeat, because there's pretty much everything from conservation to manuscript to performing arts to archaeological sites to fairs and festivals to lifestyles to language. Anything you can think of, there's a lot of material. So I think we stop here for the moment and then we continue. ये चार्ज भी नहीं हो रहा